Doctors couldn't save the millionaire's wife who got sick in the restaurant. 30 minutes later, the waiter said she could help, and everyone was paralyzed when they saw what she did. Elise's smile faltered. Her laughter was cut short by a sharp gasp. She clutched her throat, her eyes wide with panic as her body swayed. The room seemed to freeze as Jonathan jumped to his feet. "Elise," he called, his voice shaking as he caught her collapsing form. Patrons at nearby tables turned, their murmurs growing louder. The waitstaff froze momentarily before rushing over. Elise's skin turned alarmingly pale, her breathing shallow and uneven. "Call an ambulance," Jonathan yelled. Among the diners, a woman stood. "I'm a doctor," she said, stepping forward with urgency. Two other individuals also identified themselves as medical professionals. Together, they bent over Elise, checking her pulse, her breathing, and searching for any signs of what could be wrong. Jonathan hovered over them, his hands trembling as he gripped Elise's lifeless hand. "What's happening? Is she going to be okay?" His voice cracked, desperation clear. The scene grew more chaotic as patrons gathered around, whispering anxiously. Staff tried to usher them back to maintain some semblance of order, but the sight of Elise's still form held everyone captive. The doctors worked feverishly, calling for the restaurant staff to bring water, towels, anything that might assist them. A faint wheeze escaped Elise's lips, but her body remained unresponsive. As the minutes dragged on, an eerie silence crept into the room. The initial panic turned into a tense, collective dread as even the professionals appeared unsure of what was happening. Jonathan's face twisted in anguish. "Someone help her," he shouted, his voice echoing through the restaurant like a plea to the heavens. The night meant for celebration had turned into a nightmare, and the clock was ticking. The doctors surrounding Elise worked frantically. One of them, a man in his early 50s with a commanding presence, barked instructions. "Her pulse is faint. Keep her airway open. Check for any obstructions." A younger doctor leaned in, her hands steady, but her face betraying the tension she felt. No visible signs of choking. Could it be an allergic reaction? Jonathan, his hands clutching the edge of the table, leaned forward. "She's not allergic to anything. We were just eating. She was fine a minute ago." His words came out in a rush, his voice trembling with fear. The older doctor frowned, his brow furrowed. "We need epinephrine. Does anyone have an EpiPen?" A waiter sprinted to the back to search the first aid kit, returning moments later with a trembling hand holding the device. The doctor administered it swiftly, but Elise's condition didn't improve. Her breathing remained shallow, her lips tinged with an unnatural bluish hue. "What's wrong with hers?" Jonathan's voice cracked as he crouched beside Elise. His once composed demeanor had shattered. He gripped her hand tightly, his eyes darting between the doctor's and his wife's pale face. "We're doing everything we can," the younger doctor reassured him, though her tone wavered. "But her symptoms are unusual. It's not clear what's causing this." "Unusual?" Jonathan's despair turned to frustration. "Your doctors. Figure it out. She's dying." The patrons around the room stood in stunned silence. Whispers rippled through the crowd like waves, the tension palpable. A woman near the back crossed herself, while a man muttered, "This isn't happening." Despite their combined efforts, the doctors exchanged uneasy glances. "Her pulse is erratic," one said grimly. "We need advanced equipment to monitor her. Without knowing the cause, stabilizing her here is almost impossible." Jonathan's hands balled into fists. He felt powerless, the image of his wife's lifeless form searing into his mind. She had always been his anchor, his source of calm amid the chaos of his world. Now, she was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face as the clock seemed to mock them all, each second dragging them closer to the unthinkable. Finally, one of the doctors stepped back, shaking his head. "We've tried everything within our means. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." But Elise's condition was worsening by the second, and Jonathan's desperation only grew. And then, a voice broke through the chaos, a soft yet steady voice. "Let me help." The crowd turned to see a young woman, a waitress standing near the edge of the room. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped forward. She looked nothing like a medical professional, but her eyes held a quiet determination. "What did you say?" Jonathan demanded, his eyes narrowing. "I can help her," the waitress repeated. Her voice was firmer now, though it still carried a tinge of hesitation. The doctors exchanged incredulous looks. One of them spoke sharply. "Ma'am, this is a medical emergency. Unless you're a trained professional, we don't have time for—" "I know," she interrupted, her gaze never leaving Elise. "I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen this before. I can help her, I swear." Jonathan stared at the woman, his breath hitching. Desperation clouded his judgment, but a part of him clung to hope, no matter how improbable. "What are you talking about? How do you know what's wrong with her?" The waitress hesitated, glancing around the room. Everyone was staring now, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright scorn. I just know," she said softly. "Please let me try. If I'm wrong, it won't make things worse. But if I'm right," she swallowed hard, "it might save her life." Jonathan hesitated, torn between the doctor's logic and this stranger's inexplicable certainty. Finally, he looked into the waitress's eyes, searching for something, anything, that felt real. "Do it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just do it." The restaurant held its collective breath as the young waitress stepped closer to the collapsed woman. The tension was palpable, the silence punctuated only by the faint sound of Elise's labored breaths. Jonathan hovered protectively over his wife, his tear-streaked face a mixture of hope and fear. The older doctor raised a hand, his tone sharp. "This is highly irregular. You could do more harm than good." "I don't want to waste time arguing," the waitress interrupted. Her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable strength. "I've seen something like this before. I think I know what's happening. Please trust me." "What exactly do you mean? You've seen this before?" the younger doctor demanded, skepticism etched across her face. The waitress hesitated, glancing around nervously. She was aware of the weight of her words, aware that everyone's judgment was on her. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me remedies, ways to recognize certain symptoms. I'm not a doctor, but I know when something isn't right." She took a breath, her gaze falling on Elise. "This looks like poisoning." The crowd gasped. Jonathan staggered back a step, his face going pale. "Poison? What are you talking about?" "I can't say for sure," the waitress admitted, wringing her hands. "But her symptoms, difficulty breathing, her skin turning pale, it matches something my grandmother once treated. If it's what I think it is, I might be able to help her. But I need to act now." Jonathan hesitated, torn between the professionals who had failed to save his wife and this young woman whose determination seemed to spark a glimmer of hope. What would you need?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Before continuing, leave a comment because we would like to know where you are watching us from now and what time it is." The waitress squared her shoulders. "A few ingredients from the kitchen. If you let me, I'll do everything I can." The older doctor frowned, shaking his head. "This is reckless. We don't even know what's causing her condition. Medicinal remedies aren't working," Jonathan interjected, his voice hardening. He turned to the waitress. "What do you need? Tell me." She nodded, stepping into action. "Honey, ginger, and charcoal if you have it. A small bowl, and some water." Her voice steadied, and she glanced at one of the waiters standing nearby. "Please hurry." The staff scrambled into the kitchen as the crowd whispered in disbelief. "Poison? How would she know?" one patron murmured. "She's just guessing," another scoffed. But Jonathan's focus remained solely on the waitress. "If you're wrong," he began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to voice the unspeakable. "I know," she replied softly. "But if I'm right—" Moments later, the ingredients were brought out. The waitress knelt beside Elise, her movements deliberate but quick. She crushed the charcoal into a fine powder, mixing it with honey and ginger. Jonathan watched her every move, his hands trembling as he gripped the back of a chair for support. "Open her mouth," the waitress instructed. Jonathan and the younger doctor exchanged a look, then gently parted Elise's lips. The waitress administered the mixture carefully, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "This will bind to any toxins in her system," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I'm wrong, I'm sorry." The crowd leaned forward, their collective breath held as the seconds stretched into eternity. Elise's body remained still, her chest barely rising and falling. Jonathan knelt beside her, whispering her name like a prayer. And then the faintest of movements. A shallow gasp escaped Elise's lips, followed by another. Her color, though still pale, began to shift ever so slightly. The crowd murmured in astonishment as the waitress sat back, her face unreadable. Jonathan's head shot up, his voice trembling with hope. "Elise? Elise, can you hear me?" Elise's eyelids fluttered, and a weak groan escaped her throat. Jonathan let out a choked sob, clutching her hand as tears streamed down his face. The waitress exhaled shakily, the tension in her shoulders releasing as she wiped her hands on her apron. "She's not out of danger yet," she said. "But she's breathing. That's a start." The restaurant erupted into murmurs, a mix of amazement and disbelief. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances, their pride wounded, but their relief undeniable. Jonathan turned to the waitress, his expression a mixture of gratitude and wonder. How did you know?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's a long story," she said softly. "But right now she needs rest. And someone should find out what caused this." As her words sank in, the room fell silent once more. The mystery of what had happened lingered, but one thing was clear. The waitress had done the impossible. The restaurant had been transformed from a scene of celebration to a hushed theater of astonishment. Elise was alive, though still fragile, and all eyes were on the waitress who had stepped forward when no one else could. Jonathan, still kneeling beside his wife, watched as the waitress prepared another bowl of the mixture. Her movements were precise, her focus unwavering, as if the chaos around her no longer existed. "Who are you?" Jonathan finally asked, his voice hoarse. The waitress glanced at him briefly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "My name is Clara," she said, her tone measured but soft. "I've worked here for 3 years, but this isn't the first time I've had to use what I learned." The younger doctor, still skeptical, crossed her arms. "And what exactly is it that you've learned?" Clara paused, her hands stilling for a moment. "My grandmother raised me," she began. "She was a healer in our village, a midwife, a herbalist. People came to her when doctors couldn't help. I used to watch her, learn from her. She said every plant, every spice, every root had a purpose if you knew how to use it." Jonathan's gaze softened as he listened, but the older doctor remained doubtful. "Folk remedies aren't substitutes for real medicine," he said tersely. Clara's eyes met his, calm but firm. "I'm not saying they are. But sometimes, knowledge handed down through generations fills the gaps when there's no time to wait for tests or theories." She nodded toward Elise. "If I hadn't done anything, would she still be breathing right now?" The doctor had no response. Meanwhile, the staff and patrons began whispering among themselves. "How did she know it was poison?" one man murmured. "Do you think it was the food?" another asked. Clara looked up sharply. "It wasn't the food." The room fell silent. "How can you be sure?" Jonathan asked, his brow furrowing. Clara hesitated, then pointed to Elise's wine glass. "She didn't eat much of the meal, but she drank that. It's the only thing that could have affected her so quickly." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he followed her gaze. "Are you saying someone tampered with it?" Clara didn't answer directly. Instead, she returned to Elise, gently lifting her head to give her another sip of the honey and charcoal mixture. "Right now, the important thing is making sure she recovers. But yes, I think someone did this on purpose." A ripple of shock spread through the room. The idea that the incident might not have been accidental turned unease into outright fear. "Who would do such a thing?" one patron whispered. Jonathan's mind raced as he glanced at the faces in the crowd. Business rivals, jealous acquaintances, or even strangers with malicious intent. All possibilities loomed large. "We need to find out who's responsible," he said, his voice steely. Clara nodded. "But first, let's make sure she's stable. If her condition improves, then we'll have time to figure this out." Jonathan placed a hand on Clara's arm. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." Clara shook her head. "You don't need to. Just make sure she's safe." As Jonathan knelt back down beside Elise, a newfound determination filled his chest. Clara's actions had given him hope, but the mystery of what had happened threatened to unravel everything. And standing in the corner, unnoticed by most, was a figure watching the scene intently, their expression unreadable. The clock on the restaurant wall ticked loudly, marking each passing second as Elise's fragile condition hung in the balance. Clara continued administering her makeshift remedy, pausing occasionally to check for any signs of improvement. Her hands moved with practiced precision, but inside, her nerves buzzed like live wires. Jonathan sat beside Elise, holding her hand, his eyes locked on her face. Every faint flutter of her eyelids or shallow breath felt like a lifeline. "Is she going to make it?" he asked Clara, his voice cracking. Clara hesitated, not wanting to give false hope. "The signs are encouraging," she said carefully. "But her body's been through a lot. We'll need to watch her closely for the next hour or so." "An hour?" The younger doctor frowned, crossing her arms. "That's an eternity in a case like this. She should be in a hospital." Clara's expression didn't falter. "And how long would it take to get an ambulance through traffic and stabilize her there?" She glanced at Elise. "I've done what I can. Now it's up to her body to respond." The crowd remained eerily quiet, their eyes darting between Clara and Elise. Some patrons whispered in corners, speculation running rampant. "Do you think she's right about the wine being poisoned?" "It's possible, but who'd do something so terrible?" Clara overheard the murmurs, but kept her focus on Elise. She couldn't afford distractions, not now. "Jonathan," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Has anything unusual happened recently? Anyone who might want to hurt you or your wife?" Jonathan looked at her, startled by the question. I don't know. Elise is loved by everyone. She has no enemies." "No one's entirely without enemies," Clara replied gently. "Think about it." Jonathan raked a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He thought of the many people he had encountered in his high-profile life. Competitors, disgruntled employees, even jealous acquaintances. But Elise? She was kind, generous, and warm-hearted. Who could harbor such malice against her? The older doctor cleared his throat, stepping closer to Jonathan. "Even if this is poisoning, it doesn't explain everything. The symptoms are inconsistent. Are you sure your wife has no medical conditions we should know about?" "No," Jonathan replied firmly. "She's perfectly healthy. At least she was." Clara's gaze drifted back to the wineglass, still sitting untouched on the table. The deep red liquid shimmered innocently under the lights, but it now seemed sinister, like a coiled snake waiting to strike. As if reading her thoughts, Jonathan turned to one of the staff. "Take that glass. Don't let anyone near it." The waiter nodded nervously, carefully wrapping the glass in a clean napkin before carrying it away. Meanwhile, Clara continued monitoring Elise. She gently dabbed a damp cloth on her forehead, whispering quiet reassurances. Jonathan watched her closely, marveling at her composure. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked softly. Clara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "My grandmother. She always said life would test us in unexpected ways." I didn't think this was what she meant. Before Jonathan could respond, a faint cough interrupted the moment. All eyes turned to Elise, whose chest rose slightly more than before. A murmur swept through the crowd as hope blossomed in the air. "She's trying to breathe more deeply," Clara observed, her voice calm but tinged with relief. "That's a good sign." The younger doctor leaned in, her skepticism softening. "Her color's improving too?" Clara nodded, but didn't relax. "It's a step forward, but she's not out of the woods yet." The tension in the room didn't dissipate completely, but it shifted. The The focus was now on Elise's fragile recovery and the growing question of who, or what, had caused her condition. At that moment, Jonathan looked up, his gaze sweeping over the room. For the first time, he noticed a figure standing near the back wall, partially obscured by shadows. The person's eyes met his briefly before they turned and disappeared through the door.
"Who was that?"
Jonathan asked sharply, standing to his feet.
"What?"
Clara asked, startled. There was someone watching. They just left. Jonathan pointed toward the exit. "We need to find them." The room erupted in murmurs again, and Clara's heart sank. The recovery wasn't over yet, but the danger was far from gone. Elise's shallow breaths began to grow stronger, her chest rising and falling more steadily. Her complexion, once ghostly pale, now had a faint flush of color returning to it. Jonathan stayed kneeling by her side, his grip on her hand never loosening. For the first time that evening, hope replaced the fear that had gripped him since her collapse. "Her pulse is stabilizing," Clara said quietly, checking Elise's wrist with practiced care. The younger doctor, who had been observing skeptically, leaned closer. "She's responding. Her oxygen levels must be improving." Jonathan's had snapped toward Clara. "Does this mean she's going to be okay?" Clara hesitated, her eyes meeting his.
"It's a good sign," she said.
"But she's still weak. Her body needs time to recover. She'll need proper care to ensure there's no relapse." Elise stirred slightly, her fingers twitching in Jonathan's hand. A soft, almost inaudible murmur escaped her lips. Jonathan leaned in closer, his heart pounding. "Elise? Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and after a moment that felt like eternity, her eyes opened halfway. She blinked sluggishly, as if trying to orient herself. "John," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Tears welled in his eyes as he cupped her face gently. "I'm here, Elise. I'm right here." The restaurant erupted into relieved murmurs, the tension that had gripped the room beginning to dissipate. "She's waking up," someone whispered. "It's a miracle," another added. Clara stepped back slightly, letting Jonathan have his moment with his wife. But her mind was still racing. While she was relieved that Elise was improving, the mystery of what had caused her collapse gnawed at her. Elise's weak voice broke through her thoughts. "What happened?" Jonathan brushed her hair back gently. "You got sick, Elise." "But Clara here," he motioned toward the waitress. "She helped you. She saved you." Elise's bleary eyes moved toward Clara, and a faint, grateful smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you." Clara smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're welcome. Just rest for now. You've been through a lot." As the weight of the moment sank in, the older doctor cleared his throat. "I have to admit," he said, addressing Clara, "I didn't think your approach would work. But you may have saved her life." Clara nodded politely, but didn't respond. Something about the situation still didn't sit right with her. She turned toward Jonathan. "We need to figure out what caused this. She didn't collapse for no reason." Jonathan's face darkened as he remembered the figure he had seen slipping out earlier. "I think someone knows exactly what happened." Clara followed his gaze toward the door, her brow furrowing. "Did you see someone?" Jonathan nodded. "There was a man watching us earlier. When Elise started improving, he left in a hurry. I don't know who he was, but something about him didn't feel right." "Where's the wine glass?" Clara asked suddenly. A waiter stepped forward nervously, holding the napkin-wrapped glass. "It's in the kitchen. I didn't let anyone touch it, just like you said." "Good," Clara said firmly. "That might give us some answers." Jonathan's jaw clenched as he rose to his feet. "If someone did this to Elise, I'm going to find out who and why." Clara put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "We will. But right now she needs you. Let's make sure she's stable first." He hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his desire for vengeance. Finally, he nodded, kneeling once more beside Elise. As the restaurant staff began to regain some order, Clara stepped aside, her thoughts swirling. She had done her part to stabilize Elise, but the bigger question remained. Who would want to harm this woman and why? And somewhere in the shadows, The figure who had slipped out of the restaurant was already several steps ahead, blending into the night, as if they had never been there at all. The hours that followed were a mix of relief and cautious optimism. Elise's conditions steadily improved, her breathing growing stronger and her voice regaining some of its strength. Clara remained close, monitoring her as if every small sign carried the weight of the world. Jonathan refused to leave Elise's side, his hand tightly clasping hers as he spoke to her in soothing tones. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe now." Elise blinked up at him, her expression soft but tired. I don't understand what happened." Jonathan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We don't know yet," he admitted, his voice low. "But Clara, she saved you. You wouldn't be here without her." Elise turned her head slightly, her gaze finding Clara. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you," she said weakly. "You saved my life." Clara nodded, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I'm just glad you're okay," she replied. The crowd in the restaurant, which had thinned but not completely dispersed, erupted into applause. Patrons and staff alike cheered for Clara, their earlier skepticism now replaced with admiration. "You're a hero," someone shouted. "She should get an award for this," another chimed in. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she ducked her head. "I just did what I had to," she said quietly. The applause faded as the gravity of the situation returned. Clara took a step closer to Jonathan. "We still need to know what caused this," she said in a hushed tone. "If it was poison, we can't ignore the fact that someone might have done this deliberately." Jonathan's jaw clenched, and his eyes darkened. "I won't ignore it. Whoever's behind this is going to pay." At that moment, the older doctor approached, holding a small flashlight he had used to check Elise's pupils earlier. "Her vitals are stable," he said. "She should be taken to a hospital now, just to be sure there are no lasting effects." Jonathan nodded. "I'll make the arrangements immediately." As staff members began clearing the space, a waiter brought the wineglass forward, wrapped securely in a towel. "We kept this safe, just like you asked," he said nervously. Jonathan took the glass, his expression hardening. "This is the key," he said, his voice icy. "We're going to find out what's in this." As Jonathan coordinated the next steps, Clara stood apart, quietly observing. When the restaurant cleared and only a few remained, Jonathan approached her, the glass still in his hand. "Clara," he began, his voice softer now, "how did you know? How did you figure out what was wrong with her when even the doctors couldn't?" Clara sighed, brushing her hands over her apron. "It wasn't a guess," she said. "I've seen symptoms like this before." Jonathan frowned. "You mean poisoning?" She nodded. "My grandmother treated a man once. He'd been poisoned with something similar. It's a slow-acting toxin that affects the lungs first, making it hard to breathe. The symptoms don't always show up immediately, which is why it can be so dangerous." Jonathan's brows furrowed. "What kind of poison is that? Where would someone even get something like that?" Clara hesitated, the weight of her words pressing on her. "It's not something you find in everyday life. It's deliberate." Jonathan's face hardened as he stared at the wineglass. "Then someone wanted to hurt Elise," he said, his voice cold. "There's more," Clara added hesitantly. "The way the symptoms came on so suddenly, it's likely that whatever was in her wine was heavily concentrated. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Jonathan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the glass tighter. "Then it's not just some accident or a random act. This was targeted." Clara nodded. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you want to hear." Jonathan turned to look at Elise, who was resting peacefully now, her head leaning against the back of her chair. "I don't care what it takes," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I'll find out who did this and make sure they never hurt her, or anyone else again." Clara hesitated before adding, "There's one other thing. If you have that glass tested, it might confirm what kind of toxin was used. It could lead you to whoever's responsible." Jonathan nodded grimly. "I'll make sure of it." Before Elise was taken to the hospital, she reached out weakly for Clara's hand. Clara knelt beside her, her eyes kind but wary. "I owe you my life," Elise said softly. "No," Clara replied with a small smile. "You're strong.
You fought through this.
Elise shook her head slightly. Without you, I wouldn't have had the chance to fight. Jonathan stepped forward, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder. You've done more than we could ever repay, he said, his voice heavy with gratitude. Clara shook her head, her humility apparent. I'm just glad she's okay. That's all I wanted. Jonathan reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. If you ever need anything, a job, help with school, whatever it is, call me. People like you are rare. Clara hesitated, then took the card with a small nod. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the paramedics arrived to take Elise to the hospital, Jonathan turned back to Clara. This isn't over, he said. Once we know what happened, we'll make sure justice is served. Clara nodded, her expression resolute. If you need me, I'll help. As the ambulance doors closed, Clara stood in the now quiet restaurant, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had done what she could, but the truth behind Elise's poisoning was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. The wine glass sat in a sealed evidence bag on Jonathan's desk the following morning, its sinister contents waiting to reveal their secrets. He had wasted no time delivering it to a trusted laboratory for testing. Every second that passed felt like an eternity as he paced his study, replaying the events of the previous night in his mind. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Dr. Patel, the lead chemist at the lab. Mr. Evans, Dr. Patel began, her voice clipped and professional. We've analyzed the contents of the wine glass. I'm afraid your suspicions were correct. Jonathan gripped the edge of his desk. What was in it? We found traces of aconitine, she said. It's a highly toxic compound derived from the aconite plant, also known as monk's hood or wolf's bane. Ingesting even a small amount can cause symptoms like the ones your wife experienced: respiratory distress, arrhythmia, and eventual collapse. Jonathan's blood ran cold. How would someone get their hands on something like that? Dr. Patel hesitated. It's not easy to obtain. Aconite is rare and regulated in most places. This wasn't accidental, Mr. Evans. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Jonathan's grip on the desk tightened, his knuckles turning white. Thank you, Doctor. Please prepare a full report. I'll need it for the authorities. After hanging up, he sat in silence, his mind racing. Who would go to such lengths to harm Elise? And why? Later that afternoon, Clara arrived at his home, her expression wary but determined. Jonathan had called her, knowing she might be able to help connect the dots. We have confirmation, Jonathan said, handing her a copy of the lab's preliminary report. It was aconitine. Poisoned wine. Clara's brow furrowed as she scanned the document. That's not something you stumble upon by chance. This was deliberate. Jonathan nodded grimly. The question is, who had access to the wine? And why would they target Elise? Clara bit her lip, thinking. Was there anyone unusual at the restaurant? Someone who might have been acting out of place or paying too much attention to your table? Jonathan's eyes darkened as he remembered the figure he had seen slipping out of the restaurant. There was someone, he said slowly.
A man.
He was watching us the whole time. When Elise started to recover, he disappeared. Clara's eyes widened. Did anyone else see him? Jonathan shook his head. Not that I know of. But I'm going to find him. Together, they reviewed the restaurant's guest list, security footage, and staff records, searching for any clue that could lead them to the mysterious man. After hours of combing through details, they found a lead, a reservation made under a false name. The man had left no trace except for his conspicuous absence when everything unfolded. Whoever he is, Jonathan said, his voice low and dangerous, he's not getting away with this. The days following Elise's poisoning were a whirlwind of activity. As news of Clara's heroics spread, she became an unexpected figure of admiration. Journalists showed up at the restaurant, eager to interview her. Patrons who had been there that night returned to thank her personally, their words of gratitude pouring in like a flood. But Clara remained modest, shying away from the limelight. I just did what I had to do, she repeated to anyone who asked. Jonathan, however, was determined to ensure she received more than just words. At the Evans estate, Jonathan and Elise met with Clara privately. Elise, now recovering well, had insisted on seeing the young waitress again to express her gratitude. "Clara," Elise said, her voice still soft but steady, "you saved my life. There's no way to fully repay that, but we'd like to try." Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You don't owe me anything," she said earnestly. Jonathan leaned forward. "We insist. I've spoken to some of my contacts. If you'd like, we can arrange for you to attend any school of your choice. Medical school, nursing school, whatever you want. You have a gift, Clara. Let us help you nurture it." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes," Elise said with a warm smile. After a moment's hesitation, Clara nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." Later that evening, Jonathan and Elise sat together in their living room, the weight of the past days still hanging over them. Elise, though visibly stronger, held onto Jonathan's hand as if it were her anchor. "Do you think we'll ever know who did this?" Elise asked softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We will. I've already contacted the authorities. They're following leads, analyzing the evidence. Whoever did this won't get away with it." Elise nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "What if it wasn't about me?" Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean? What if it was about you, John?" Elise's voice trembled. "Your business, your success. There are people who might want to hurt you. What if they thought hurting me was the way to do it?" Jonathan's heart clenched at the thought. "Then I've put you in danger," he said quietly. "And I'll never forgive myself for that." Elise cupped his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "It's not your fault. But we have to be careful. We can't let this happen again." Jonathan nodded, determination hardening his features. "We'll find out the truth," he said firmly. "And we'll make sure no one can ever come near us like that again." Outside, the evening air carried a sense of uneasy calm, the kind that hinted at battles yet to be fought. In the weeks following Elise's recovery, life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy, though it was a new kind of normal for everyone involved. Clara, now hailed as a hero, accepted Jonathan and Elise's offer to fund her education. She enrolled in a prestigious program for alternative medicine and public health, determined to merge her ancestral knowledge with modern techniques. The restaurant where she worked became a local landmark, its reputation boosted by the extraordinary story. People visited not just for the food, but to meet the humble waitress who had saved a millionaire's wife with nothing more than a grandmother's wisdom and quick thinking. Clara, however, remained focused on her studies. She moved into a modest apartment provided by the Evans family and spent her evenings poring over textbooks and research papers. Jonathan ensured she had everything she needed, from financial support to professional mentors. "You gave us a second chance at life," he told her once, during a quiet meeting at his office. "The least we can do is help you build yours." Meanwhile, Elise's recovery continued smoothly. She returned to her philanthropic work with renewed vigor, using her platform to promote awareness about food safety and the importance of medical preparedness in public spaces. She often credited Clara publicly, ensuring the young woman received the recognition she deserved. For Jonathan and Elise, the ordeal had forged an even deeper bond. They began spending more time together, prioritizing their personal lives over the demands of Jonathan's business empire. The investigation into Elise's poisoning bore fruit sooner than expected. The wine glass, combined with security footage and witness statements, led authorities to a startling conclusion. The man Jonathan had seen leaving the restaurant was identified as a former employee of one of his competitors. Further digging revealed a disturbing motive. The man had been hired to sabotage Jonathan's life as part of a broader scheme to tarnish his reputation. Elise had not been the original target. Jonathan had been. The plan was to poison his drink during the dinner, but the mix-up with glasses meant that Elise unknowingly consumed it instead. When confronted by authorities, the man confessed, though he refused to name the person who hired him. Evidence pointed to a rival corporation with a history of underhanded tactics, but proving direct involvement remained difficult. Jonathan's anger burned white-hot at the discovery. "They went after my wife to get to me," he said to Elise one night, his hands clenched into fists. I won't let this go unanswered. Elise, however, placed a calming hand on his shoulder. John, justice will come, she said gently. But don't let their hatred consume you. Focus on what matters, us. Jonathan nodded, though the fire in his eyes didn't dim entirely. I'll make sure they never hurt anyone else. That's a promise. Months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Clara stood outside the university campus, clutching her backpack and a steaming cup of tea. Her classes were demanding, but she felt more fulfilled than ever before. She often thought about the night that had changed everything, how one decision to act had transformed not only her life, but those of the Evans family as well. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Elise hosted a charity gala in their sprawling estate, inviting friends, business associates, and the media to celebrate life and resilience. During the event, Elise took the stage to deliver a heartfelt speech. I wouldn't be here tonight if not for the bravery of one young woman, she said, her voice steady yet emotional. Clara reminded me that heroes don't always wear capes. They wear aprons, uniforms, or whatever life requires of them. She taught me the value of compassion and the courage to act when it matters most. In the audience, Clara sat quietly, her cheeks flushing as the room erupted into applause. The evening ended with a heartfelt toast. Jonathan raised his glass, his voice resonating with gratitude. To Clara, to Elise, and to all of us who've been reminded of what truly matters: love, courage, and the people who make life worth fighting for. As the glasses clinked and laughter filled the room, Clara couldn't help but smile. She had stepped into that night as an unnoticed waitress, and she had walked out forever changed. And somewhere, in the quiet moments that followed, each person carried with them a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by the power of one brave act in the face of uncertainty.